Second part. Destruction ran tooth and nail through the castle's interior, and in accordance with the building's strange construction, it struck in the most unlikely places. 2 floors below the laboratory, not so much as a speck of dust stirred, yet the underground prison took a direct hit. The next thing Dust knew, he was outside the prison. The wall before his eyes was split open, with pitch blackness filling the gap. One after another, cold specks struck his cheeks. Snowflakes. There was a snowstorm raging. His right shoulder hurt him terribly. Though he turned back for a look at the prison, he couldn't see it for the mountain of rubble. There was some question as to whether the prison had actually been there or not. He put his hand against his shoulder. It was clearly broken, a critical injury for a bodyguard. Getting up, he turned his eyes toward the crack. As soon as he was through it, he rolled off to one side. His left knee felt like it was burning from the inside out. There was a fragment of something stuck in it. He intended to cool it off with the snow. Sticking his leg in the snow, he reached for his shoulder with his left hand. He had no intention of fleeing. As long as Vera and Lurie were in the castle, his job guarding them wasn't finished. After he put snow on his shoulder a number of times, the sound of snow underfoot reached his ears. The being that had saved them from the mountain folk flashed to his mind. They didn't know yet whether that was a friend or a foe, and the footsteps might also be those of the mountain folk. He didn't have a weapon. Dust picked up a chunk of rock that lay at his feet. The snowstorm was fairly strong. Up ahead, a gray figure came hazily into view. He couldn't tell the range. It was probably 20 yards or more away. Sleepiness suddenly assailed him. The snow that dulled his pain had numbed his consciousness. If I go to sleep, I'll die. This is no good. He tried to snap out of it, but his consciousness started to slide away. He put his strength into his right arm. An acute pain, like his shoulder was being ripped off, restored his focus. Dust opened his eyes and followed the shadowy figure with them. It stood right in front of him. Displaying a wild growth of hair and beard, the man wore an old pair of goggles and battered clothes that were like animal skins and knotted to a parka. The bow he carried and the quiver on his hip made Dust tense up. "Are you Lurie's father?" the bodyguard asked. The pair of vacant eyes in that deeply snowburned face reflected Dust. Suddenly, they burned red. Page break. Dee halted. Since leaving the hall, he'd been wandering the castle's interior for more than an hour. Even his left-hand sense of direction had become befuddled. "The castle's layout is like a labyrinth," it said. "If it were one of the nobility's mazes, I could manage something, but it uses alien laws of physics. Probably technology those faceless bastards brought with them. From what I hear, that clown's got a rivalry with the sacred ancestor, and he aims to make another with you. With Gilson's combat abilities trumping yours, and stuff from wherever those UFOs call home. He could probably do it.
Where has Gilson's chamber shifted to?
See, the thing is, the blueprints I memorized keep changing over and over. Now, it's kinda indistinct. It's vanished from the blueprints.
I can't just keep walking around.
I know that, but where are we supposed to go?
Suddenly, the floor beneath the hunter began to move. It was the moving sidewalk Vera had ridden. Dee stayed on it. With no set destination, there was no need to get off. He jolted along for about 5 minutes, but encountered no one.
Too damn big,
the hoarse voice said, and its impression was right on the mark. Wherever the skirmishes were taking place, they hadn't spread to where Dee was. In the next 10 minutes of riding the moving sidewalks, Dee changed the section he was on 3 times. Even the hoarse voice was quiet. It was the hunter who seemed to choose the path to their destination. At times disembarking from the moving sidewalks, at other times boarding them. Before long he came to see an enormous door up ahead. Though one characteristic of the ancient nobility was having every imaginable place covered with carvings and sculptures, this door, over 30 feet wide and 15 feet high, was utterly devoid of ornamentation. Before that glossy bluish-black surface, Dee stepped off the moving sidewalk. Flames burned in iron braziers to either side of the door.
Here?
The hoarse voice inquired. It too seemed to understand this was the new destination.
There must be some vortex of supernatural air here that drew you all this way. Only the tiniest portion of it is escaping. But look at me, I've got goosebumps. Do you hear that?
Dee nodded. His eyes gave off a red glow. And look, peeking from the corners of his trembling lips, the fangs of a vampire.
You hear them, don't you? The noises those inside are making?
The left hand said.
They sense you, too. Your presence. They're scared. And in high spirits, and filled with joy. At the thought of eating you up, that is. Don't do it. I ain't saying they're more than you can handle, just that it's a waste of time. That, and there's the concern that your psyche might get warped. Oh, those eyes and those teeth of yours. And what's with that blood? So excited you've chewed through your own lip? I don't care how cool and collected you are. As long as you've got noble blood in you, you can't fight the thrill of battle. Okay, let's move along now.
Dee's right hand went for the hilt on his back.
Stop, don't do it.
The left hand shirt stretched out to the side. At the same time, Dee let out an insane cry. At the same time, Dee let out an insane cry and drove his sword into the great steel door. There was smoke. Still poised as he'd been when he struck with his blade, Dee didn't move. The blade of his sword was stuck in the steel, and his left hand reached for the brazier. Little by little, the flames burned his hand. Suddenly letting out his breath, Dee allowed the tension to drain from him. As he stood up straight, he pulled his blade back out, then brought back his left hand. He closed his melted fingers tight. He'd stuck his hand into the flames of his own volition. The heat of his flesh burning had returned him to his senses. His blade hadn't cut very deeply into the door.
You're crazy,
his left hand told him. Dee's fingers were already back to normal.
We really escaped by a hair's breadth that time. The cut may be shallow, but I can't believe he managed even that much. You truly are his own.
What's that? Dee, why do you have to ask that in a way that makes the blood run cold in all who hear your query? His hand fell silent. Dee's eyes turned to the far end of the moving sidewalk. A second sidewalk ran in the opposite direction, parallel to the first. Far down it, a number of figures appeared. All were on their knees or leaning on what appeared to be spears, having the air of the wounded about them. In fact, the men actually were covered in blood, and their breathing was faint. They were soldiers of the same sacred protector knights Dee had fought. But they weren't just returning from a battle with him. Those who turned a blade against Dee were left worse than wounded. Suddenly the soldiers turned around. Letting out cries of fear, they leveled their weapons. A tall figure was coming down the moving sidewalk with long strides. It was one of the faceless, four-armed creatures. One of its right hands held some sort of pistol, and one of the left ones a sword. Apparently it had lost its long spear and crossbow in the course of the battle. One of the soldiers got up and hurled the sword he held. His foe's left hand shot out, and the weapon was deflected with a sound of unearthly beauty, piercing the heart of the soldier who'd thrown it. The remaining soldiers didn't choose to flee. Taking weapons in hand, they charged their enemy en masse. A split second before they did, one at the very back of the group turned in Dee's direction. Their eyes met. It was only for a moment. The soldier then followed the others. Sparks sprayed from the faceless one's sword, and the weapon that resembled a pistol sent a succession of green rays flying. The soldiers the ray struck in the chest glowed with the same hue, dissolved into a mere outline, and abruptly vanished. Only the last one remained. The soldier charged forward with a shrill cry. Its stance and movements made it clear that here was someone who'd fought better than most in training. A blast from the gun in the foe's right hand was easily deflected, and then the enemy's longsword flashed out. Something heavy thudded at Dee's feet. The severed head of the soldier. It gazed sadly at Dee. This person hadn't wanted to die. Not after returning to life for the first time in 10 millennia. The soldier was a woman. Dee raised his eyes. The four-armed foe was just a bit to pass him. It saw the hunter. Striking the pose of a vengeful guardian deity, it stepped from the moving sidewalk. There it halted. Nor did Dee move. The gun came up. The barrel of the weapon got the faintest green glow, and then it faded. Blue light swayed against Dee's chest. Returning the gun to its hip, his foe drew its longsword. At that point someone said, "Don't get in my way." Dee turned his eyes alone toward the speaker. The voice came from the same direction as his foe. A new figure glided over. Sword raised by the side of her head like a baseball bat. It was the huntress Lilia who glared at the enemy. "I'll deal with this thing." The enemy also heard her. As it turned toward Lilia, it also leveled its firearm. The flash of green light passed beneath Lilia's boots, vanishing into the depths of the darkness. As she came back down to earth, Lilia swung her blade down at the top of the enemy's head. Her right hand, lost to Vera's ultra-high-speed vibrations, was now as good as new. Her opponent parried the blow with its firearm. The blade of the sword cut the gun in two, halting there. The creature's other right hand had grabbed Lilia's wrist to stop her. "Let go of me." Her body writhed in midair, and the enemy thrust the sword in its left hand at her. It then twisted in a physically impossible position to split the flask of a stark wooden needle. Still gripping Lilia, the foe turned toward Dee. That face devoid of eyes, nose, and mouth blew an egregious air of malice at the hunter. With the right hand that had hurled the needle now going for the hilt of his longsword, Dee took his first step forward. Second part, end.